in welcoming Oliver Chanarin. So welcome, Oliver.
Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce Oliver briefly. Oliver's an artist that works primarily with photography. And an interesting fact that I learned while researching this talk is that you, I believe, studied artificial intelligence in your undergrad.
That's right, yeah.
You were ahead of the game by a few decades, which I hope we'll come back to in the conversation. I'm sure many of you know Oliver from a over 2 decades long collaboration with Adam Bromberg, which the artists, I forget what the wording was, they put to death, I believe, in February 2021, after 23 years of collaboration. And the book that we're going to be discussing, A Perfect Sentence, is your first major project since then. A Perfect Sentence is a portrait of Britain, and I guess like so many countries, maybe every country in the world right now, a country that is in deep crisis, in the midst of an identity crisis. So I'm curious to know, given the scope of your work in the past, kind of what made you decide to take on that, that kind of colossal, ambitious task right now?
Well, thank you for that introduction. And to be honest, as you say, I had been working collaboratively with Adam for 25 years. And when you work in a collaboration, it's very powerful because you're a force together, but you also lose a sense of yourself. And so when it ended, and what we did was we created something called the later state of Bromberg and Chanarin. So we sort of killed ourselves, and there were some obituaries written in the paper, and it was this kind of almost celebration of our own death. But when it was over, I did feel a lot of uncertainty about what I cared about, to be honest. Like, what do I actually care about? Do I care about photography? And what does it mean to make pictures? And what do I represent as well in the world today? Because it's not the same thing that it was when I started taking photographs. But I think my impulse was to just go back to the thing that inspired me to begin photography in the first place. And so this book is kind of an experiment in going back to the beginning of making pictures, and specifically making documentary images, going out into the world, having random encounters with strangers. And I felt also, and maybe this is something to do with the world that we live in and social media, that our worlds have contracted. And there's a lot less of, or maybe it's just that I've got a family and I'm stuck in Hackney most of the time. But, our worlds have contracted, and there is this sense of an echo chamber where we hear the same voices. And I kind of was yearning to have some experiences that were accidental. I wanted to encounter people in the streets and have conversations and confrontations and debates and be pushed and be challenged a bit more than I felt. So that was the beginning of this book. It was post-Brexit, it was post-COVID, and it was a decision to go out and make a work that was broadly sort of inspired by August Sander and this idea of making a kind of photographic survey of Britain in this moment.
Right.
It didn't go very well, by the way.
Well, maybe we could see the spreads of the book now on screen. I mean, you mentioned, the project as kind of going back to your first experiences with photography. And one of the, as we can see from the cover, there are multiple covers to the book. But one of the striking features of this book is that it's made up of, photographs in progress, as it were. It's test prints, annotated with notations for the darkroom in terms of exposure or the different indications, and normally things that we are not used to seeing in the world, let alone in book form. So how did you arrive at that strategy for A Perfect Sentence?
Okay, so making the book took quite a long time, and I was taking a lot of pictures. I probably took about 3,000 photographs. And so I decided to start printing the pictures as I was going. And I was very lucky because in the studio where I work, in the building where my studio is, there was another photographer, Nigel Sheffron, who had a dark room that he let me go in there. And I started I'm not very good at printing, to be honest. And I started just sort of trying to make these color prints, trying to get the skin tones right, trying to make the tones neutral. And I just kept making these really bad pictures, bad prints. And I kept on trying and trying and trying. And eventually I kind of landed on these kind of perfect prints. And at that point, I sort of stepped back a bit and I thought, actually, these are less interesting than the process pictures. Because when you do a color print, you get the exposure right, and then you get the color tones right, and you slowly try to get it as close as you can to reality. But it's very, very subjective. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt that this kind of subjectivity of the pictures, this sense that they're not perfect, and this idea that the picture is never finished, I kind of wanted to give that sense to the project because the project was never finished. And this idea of a survey felt, in a way, absurd and bizarre. And it was so far from being something that was objective. It was a highly subjective journey of many accidental encounters. And there was nothing scientific about it.
I think this is another really interesting aspect of the book is that, you mentioned August Sander. You give us almost no information about, the book is, heavily made up of portraits, but we're told virtually nothing about these people. We're not told about the locations in which these photographs are taken. And I believe the only kind of, there's a cryptic sequence of numbers that accompanies each image in the index, which speaks more to like digital imagery than the analog images that you've actually made in the book. So can you talk a little bit about that decision of sort of leaving all of that out, or not providing any of those reference points for the reader of the book?
So I do write a text in the back of the book which kind of expands on the process of making the pictures. But it's interesting when you make a portrait of somebody. It's very collaborative. You say to the person, "Can I take your picture?" And of course, you get them to sign a release form, and then and you have this encounter with each other, which feels very collaborative. But then you leave that person behind, and you take that picture and you print it and you frame it, and you also juxtapose it together with other images in a book or in an exhibition, and suddenly the person in that picture recedes as an author. The collaborative aspect of it is diminished, and this is something I've always struggled with as a photographer. It's just this feeling that I take a picture of somebody and that's my picture, and I'm the author of it, but the person in the picture feels that it's theirs as well, and there's this real tension. So I was really wrestling with this idea of consent. And I had a lot of encounters that were really troubling on this journey, which were to do with a huge anxiety that people feel in the world, or certainly in Britain, about having their picture taken. And I think when I first started being a photographer, I would have a show and like 10 people would come, or I'd do a book and 100 people would buy a copy of the book. But now the pictures go viral. The distribution is so vast that there's a lot more fear and a lot more anxiety associated with this moment of being photographed. So the book actually became less a portrait of Britain and much more of a kind of an analysis of this exchange between me and the people that I was photographing. So in a way, it was less about each individual person, to be honest, and it became more about this act of photographing. But I also, you allude to this kind of numbering system in the back. And I always knew that when I showed this work, I was never going to show it in this kind of traditional way of an exhibition of pictures on the wall. Because when I first conceived of the work, I also started a process of building a machine that is part of the exhibition, which displays the images.
Maybe we can actually see the video which kind of displays what you're mentioning now.
So picking up on kind of August Sander and this idea of kind of cataloging people, about archetyping people, about creating, sort of putting people in boxes, and just the whole way that photography is so linked to this idea of mapping and cataloging and creating archetypes, and the kind of problem of that, the problematization of that, and also how, you know, social media has kind of continued that history of typing people and tagging people. I conceived of this exhibition, which I first prototyped in San Francisco at SF MoMA, and I've now built a second version, which is going to be touring. And this machine is designed to essentially mine stacks of photographs on the ground and put them on the wall. And it takes them off the wall and it puts them in the stack. And it works according to this kind of algorithm that you never really know what it is. But the numbers in the book are all of the kind of tags that are associated with each picture that the machine uses to identify the pictures. Yeah.
Okay. And so, as I understand it, so as you're saying, the book is you know, kind of one iteration of this project, and so I believe it's going to be a series of regional exhibitions with different iterations. So, is it right that in each case you're kind of never going to see the same, you know, the same group or the same presentation of the work?
Yeah, because when you walk into the room, you see only the pictures on the wall, and because they're always changing, you never see everything. So you never see the complete archive. You only ever see a glimpse of it. And I think I wanted to create this kind of frustration of not being able to see everything. But also the people in the pictures, again, they recede even further away. They become not even people anymore. They become objects that are being handled and stored and sorted. And, you know, when I decided to build this machine, I went to one of the big automated factories that Amazon use for all of their sorting. And basically, this machine is modeled on that. And I guess like there's a lot of interest in photography about the kind of virtual, the image, the digital image. But what I'm more interested in is actually where this digital world encounters the physical. You know, when you buy an avocado online, you click a button. But something very physical has to happen. A machine travels along a warehouse and finds that avocado and puts it in a truck and sends it to you. And so I think we live in this digital world which feels very frictionless. You know, we zoom in on images and we click on things and we slide frictionlessly through this kind of online experience. But actually the internet hits the real world very fundamentally in these warehouses and studios and factories. And I wanted to create an exhibition that felt more like a factory than an art gallery.
And the last question I wanted to ask you about is the title, A Perfect Sentence. The book opens actually not with photographs, but with 8 sentences, or prompts, maybe you could call them. And so could you tell us a little bit about the title and the decision to kind of open the book with those sentences?
It might be helpful if I read them out.
Okay,
I don't know, but could I just grab that book a sec? So this is a kind of a manifesto that dictated how the pictures were made, and I'll read it to you. Don't reduce me to tears as a form of control. Don't allow my allegations to go unrecorded. Don't assert your authority through sarcasm. Don't take me in a car on a journey alone. Sorry. Don't capture my image without consent. Don't do things for me that I can do for myself. Don't walk with your hands in your pockets. don't contact me. And this is a series of statements that I've robbed from the health and safety and the safeguarding documents that I had to sign when I was working collaboratively with museums and art centers and community centers in the production of this work. And it really started because on one of the first shoots, I got into a lot of trouble by posting something on Instagram, and the person didn't like it, and I apologized and I deleted it. But as a result of that, my exhibition was cancelled, and an acquisition to the Tate was cancelled, and there were huge repercussions as a result of me transgressing this list of rules. And so that happened right at the beginning, and I kind of took a moment to read some of the safeguarding documents that artists are given to sort of help them navigate encounters with other people. And that became the kind of frame for the production of the work.
Thank you so much, Oliver. So we have time for a question from the audience.
Kia ora tātou and Shelton. Do I need to yell? I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about the connect, if you like, between your conceptual desire to expose this AI operation and the sinister aspect of that it can be, you know, the way that it can be used, and the darkroom experimental aspect of the work. So the, you know, the test strips and the crayon markers, the holding back of different parts of the prints. How do you see those two things as being connected conceptually, and how does the darkroom apparatus help to build the overall, I guess, layering and conceptual strength of the work?
That's a really interesting question, and I kind of preface the answer to say that I don't know. As in, when I start a piece of work, I have an idea that changes, and what I hope is that where I end up is not where I began, and I think that's what happened in this work. I didn't know what it was going to feel like to be in the room with a robot with these images. But what I did know was that there was an atmosphere that I wanted to create, which was a kind of attention and two things rubbing against each other in the opposite way, like a kind of between something that felt very intimate and very personal and very human and vulnerable, that came into contact with the cold, mechanical activity of this machine that feels more like you're in a factory setting. And the more that there was a tension between those two feelings, the better. I wanted people to walk into the room and to feel that they were being watched just as much as they were watching. And I think that's very true of the world we live in and the life of images today with the internet and with social media, that when we look at pictures, pictures look at us. And when we look at images, all sorts of information about us is being given away. And so I wanted this feeling of intimacy and tenderness rammed up against the kind of coldness of the machine and the sense of being surveyed. I don't know if that answers your question.
So that is all we have time for. Maybe I would invite you all to keep Oliver's words in mind as you go around the rest of Paris Photo, about thinking about that dynamic, perhaps. Oliver is going to be signing copies of the book tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 p.m. on the Loose Joints booth, which is SE31.
Yeah, and I'm just going to be over there now as well, so if anybody has other questions, you can come and hit me up.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Now, and also let me mention, which I forgot to mention earlier, that Gillian Edelstein is going to be signing copies of her book at Ghost Books, which is SE15 right now.